Hi, my name is Maylene, and thank you so much for being here because today we are going to be talking about all of the major denominations of Christianity. I do want everyone to know that this isn't going to be like A+ sleuthing. We're not going to be talking about any of the denominations in depth. Like, this is not going to be like a scholarly peer-reviewed research article. Okay, I'm just kind of talking out of my ass most of the time, but I did do research for this, so I do want you guys to know. This video also isn't meant to be some sort of Christian propaganda. Like, I'm not trying to get you to convert to Christianity in any way, shape, or form. I personally am not a follower of Christianity. I am a lapsed Catholic, which is a lot of the reason why I am interested in this stuff. I'm mostly here to talk about it because it's fun and also maybe to be a little bit educational, but the fun part is the important part that I want you to take from this, okay? So yeah, like I said, we're going to be talking about all of the major denominations of Christianity as well as the timeline during which these events occurred. I'm not going to be talking about every single one of the Christian denominations, truthfully, because there are roughly like 45,000 different denominations of Christianity around the globe. So I'm going to be putting most of my focus into the 6 major branches of Christianity, as well as some of these smaller, important denominations within each branch. And again, this isn't meant to be some sort of Christian propaganda. I'm not trying to get you to convert. And honestly, if you disagree with anything that I'm going to say, like if you disagree with the fact that there are 6 major denominations, because I know that some people, depending on what branch of Protestantism you are, there are like 7 or 8 major branches of Christianity. I'm only going to be talking about 6 today. Honestly, do whatever you want. I don't give a shit. This is just meant to be fun. There is not an exact science to this. So, before we talk about the major branches of Christianity and the events that caused them to split from each other, I do think we need to talk about early Christianity first in order to understand what the denominations are fighting about. So, the term early Christianity simply refers to the historical era of Christianity that begins with the death of the historical Jesus Christ in 33 CE and it ends in 325 CE with the First Council of Nicaea. But early Christianity as a term has also been used to describe a minor subsect of the Jewish people that came about at the end of Second Temple Judaism. What is Second Temple Judaism? Okay, so Second Temple Judaism marks the period between 516 BCE, which was when the Second Temple was built, and its destruction by the Romans in 70 CE, almost 600 years after it was built. And Second Temple Judaism is referred to as such because the building of the Second Temple represented the Jewish people's literal and figurative return to the Holy Land from which they had been cast out by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II in 587 BCE. So, also known as Nebuchadnezzar the Great, Nebuchadnezzar II was the second king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and he was the longest reigning monarch of the Babylonian Empire after ruling for 43 years. Super slay of him. After his death in 562 BCE, he was widely considered to be the most powerful ruler in the world, but at the time, the Jewish people considered him to be the destroyer of nations and the greatest enemy that they had faced up to that point. I'm not saying this out of my ass. This is written like in the Torah or something like that. It's mentioned in the Torah that they did not like Nebuchadnezzar II. The reason that they didn't like Nebuchadnezzar II is because in 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II lay siege against the kingdom of Judah, which was already weak for a variety of reasons, but mostly because Egypt and Babylon had been fighting over control of Judah and the surrounding kingdoms for 20 years to that point. They are ultimately defeated, and Nebuchadnezzar razed the capital city of Jerusalem. He destroyed the first temple, which was also known as Solomon's temple. Now, a little bit more backstory on that. I feel like I wrote too much backstory, but I also feel like this is all very important. You can tell me if this is important to you or not, but it's really important to me that you know this. So, Solomon was the son of David, the legendary king of the United Kingdom of Israel. It's believed that the first temple was commissioned by Solomon sometime during his very, very, very long reign, sometime either during the 10th and 8th centuries, although many modern scholars question the historicity of the temple because no remains of the destroyed temple have ever been found in archaeological excavations. Also, no one actually knows, one, if the temple was real. They also don't know if Solomon was real or if David was real. Like I said, they are legendary figures, they are legendary kings. It is believed by modern scholars that both David and Solomon were based on real monarchs, but like the actual figures of David and Solomon that are recorded in scripture are just legendary figures. They were made up, basically. Anyways, that's not the fucking point. The point is, following the destruction of Solomon's temple in 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II forcibly relocated a large number of Judeans from the destroyed Jerusalem to Babylon, where they remained until 539 BCE when the First Persian Empire defeated the Babylonian Empire. So after defeating the Babylonians, the Persians allowed the displaced Judeans to return to Judah, and this period during which the Jewish people were forced to live in Babylon is now known as the Babylonian exile. I do want to mention that even though the Persians allowed the Jewish people to return to Judea, not all of them elected to return to Judea. A lot of them decided to stay in Babylon because they weren't treated as prisoners, they weren't treated as slaves. For all intents and purposes, they were treated kind of well, like they were just normal guys just living in a new place. The only transgression, at least that I can see from like my modern secular view, is that they were forced out of their homeland. So a lot of Judeans elected to stay in Babylon while the other half or so returned to Judea. So the second temple was built upon the Jewish people's return to Judea. Have I been saying it wrong the entire time? It's Judah, not Judea. Fuck me. They're the Judeans. They go to Fuck. I don't know where I fucked up, so I'm just going to keep going. So the second temple was built upon the Jewish people's return to Judah, and it is referred to as Second Temple Judaism, not only because the second temple was built, duh, but because the Jewish people and the Jewish religion itself experienced intense cultural, political, and religious developments that separated it from First Temple Judaism. The most notable development of Second Temple Judaism was the rejection of a native Jewish monarchy, i.e., the Davidic line, which had ruled Judah from the time of the legendary figure King David up until the Babylonian exile. And it's not as though the Davidic line had gone extinct. Like, the family is still alive and kicking, and they're like around, you know? But the house was largely excluded from holding major political power in favor of high priests. The Second Temple Judaism era is when we see the rise of the high priests who acted as intermediaries between the Jewish people and whatever empire was controlling the region at the time. So, as I mentioned earlier, the early Christians were a minor subsect of Second Temple Judaism that arose towards the end of the period. Early Christianity is sometimes considered the fifth subsect of Second Temple Judaism, and the other four subsects are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. So these four sects didn't arise until about 400 years after the start of the Second Temple Judaism period. When is the second century BCE? That's 199 to 101. So, and then they okay, so yeah, like 400 years, 500, 400. I'm gonna no, 500. So they didn't arise until the Maccabean Revolt during the 2nd century BCE. The Maccabean Revolt was a revolt led by a group of Jewish rebel warriors called the Maccabees against the Seleucid Empire and the general Hellenization of Jerusalem, which was caused by Alexander the Great's conquest of the Near East almost 200 years prior. Like, I don't know how much about Alexander the Great is general knowledge, but I read a book about him, and basically he was obsessed with the Greeks. He loved Greek culture. And it makes sense because Macedonia is literally like next door neighbors to the Greeks. So they were just like really close in terms of culture. Like, I think they're basically Greek. I think that's also heresy to say that the Macedonians and the Greeks were basically the same, but they were very similar. But Alexander the Great loved Greece so much. And when he conquered like the Middle East all the way up to India, he brought Greek culture all the way over there. He Hellenized just the Middle East, and he didn't really Hellenize India because he was only there for like a week and then he died. But he loved Greece so much, and every place, barring like India, maybe, really took to Greek culture, and it stuck around for a long time. And the Maccabeans didn't like that. But they lost, obviously. But even though the Maccabean revolt ended with the Seleucid Empire retaining their control over Judea, the revolt caused Second Temple Judaism to divide into the four competing sects, all of which had their own theological and political goals. We're mostly not going to actually, what am I saying? We're not going to be focusing on any of the four sects, but early Christianity, or Jewish Christianity as it's also referred to, was the fifth and final sect of Second Temple Judaism that arose around 33 CE, which coincides with the death of Jesus Christ, as I mentioned before. And early Christianity was one of two sects that survived the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE. The other sect to survive were the Pharisees, and their way of practicing Judaism is believed to have evolved into modern day rabbinic Judaism. So, is that totally true and scholarly? But I didn't consult any rabbinic Jews before I wrote that fact down in my script. So, like I said, this is not A plus scholarly work here. This is B minus at most. So now the period of early Christianity contains two distinct eras. The first is the Apostolic Age, and the second is the Patristic era. We're mostly going to be focusing on the Apostolic Age, but the Apostolic Age basically refers to the period of the 12 apostles, typically from the time of the Great Commission. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Up until the death of the last apostle, which is believed to be John the Apostle in 100 CE. So, yeah, the Apostolic Age is the more important of the two early Christian eras in reference to what we're going to be talking about today. I'm sure the patristic era is also equally as important, but not to this topic. We're talking about the apostolic age we're going to be paying closer attention to just because it is the specific era from which most or all of these Christian denominations that we're going to be talking about claim direct descent, and it's going to be how they claim to be the one holy Catholic apostolic church. First major split in Christianity occurred in 431 CE in the aftermath of the Council of Ephesus. The Council of Ephesus was the third ecumenical council held and attended by Christian bishops in order to attain consensus in the church regarding Christendom. That's not a real word. It doesn't sound like a real word. Christendom. Awesome. I'm not saying that right. The Council of Ephesus was convened by the Roman Emperor Theodosius II, and it resulted in the confirmation of the original Nicene Creed, which had been adopted and written, partially written, at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, so about 100 years before the Council of Ephesus. The Council of Ephesus was also convened in order to condemn Nestorius, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, because he argued that the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, should be called Christokos, which meant Christ bearer, instead of Theotokos, which meant God bearer. Okay, but what the fuck does this mean? So, the theological debate that led to the Council of Ephesus basically revolved around the church's inability to answer the question, if God is all good, then how can Jesus be human if humanity has been inherently tainted by original sin since the fall of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden? And this question can basically be translated to, if God is good, then how can Jesus also be God and also human, because God is good but human bad? Much of the church at this point believed that Jesus Christ was consubstantial with God the Father, or he is made of the same substance that God the Father is made of, which means that they are made of the exact same thing, like they are the exact same being in two forms. The church also argues that this occurs at conception, like them being made of the same exact substance and them being the same substance in two forms. This occurs at conception, and the church believes to this day that God's divine nature entered into Mary's womb and entangled with the human fetus, thereby connecting the human and the divine. Yeah? Did my hand motions make it easier to understand. My guy Nestorius, on the other hand, believed that the perfect union between the human and the divine was impossible, and he cited two reasons. And these reasons make total sense to me, actually. The first reason is that humanity inherently grows and matures before eventually dying, and this is something that God cannot do as a divine figure. Like, divine figures are thought to be static and immortal. They do not change, they do not grow, they do not mature, and they definitely don't die. So, how can Jesus Christ, who both grew from baby to man, matured from child to adult, and then died, also be divine if divinity does not grow, mature, die? So that's the first reason. The second reason that Nestorius cites is that Jesus, if he was both human and divine, he should have possessed the same extraordinary abilities and powers that God does, which would separate from humans, but he doesn't. I think some people would argue that Jesus does have these powers because how the fuck do you explain him raising Lazarus back from the dead or turning water into wine? But I would like to raise you the fact that he didn't actually do these things, he asked God to do them. He was like, hey, God, can you do this for me? And then God did it. Because of these 2 points arguing that Jesus Christ is not both human and divine, he is one or the other, he proposed that Mary should be referred to as the Christ bearer rather than the God bearer because Jesus was not divine at birth, but rather he becomes divine at the point of resurrection. So she didn't actually give birth to a god, she just gave birth to a dude. The church, who believes that Jesus Christ is both human and divine at the same time, and that he and God are made of the same exact substance, and they are the same substance, but they're just in two different forms, they basically declared Nestorius a heretic, and he was exiled to Egypt by Theodosius in 435 CE. Does that make sense? Like, does the reasoning make sense? I feel like it doesn't make any sense. Here's a brilliant example that I came up with. The church is arguing that Jesus and God are made of the same substance, but they're just in two different forms. Imagine it's Play Doh, and you have a jar of Play Doh, and you just take the Play Doh out of the jar and you hold it, and that is just one Play Doh. It's all the same Play Doh because it came out of the same jar. But then you split that ball of Play Doh in half, and now there's two Play Dohs, but they're still technically the same Play Doh. They came from the same place, they are made of the same stuff, they're the same color. The only difference is that originally came from one big Play Doh, but then you just split it in two Play Dohs. But it's still the same Play Doh, just in two different balls of Play Doh. Does that make sense? That's what the church is arguing. But Nestorius is arguing one jar of Play Doh is God and a completely separate jar of Play Doh is Jesus. So we have the pink Play Doh over here, that's God. And then the yellow Play Doh over here, that's Jesus. So the yellow Play Doh, Jesus, simply is not the same as the pink Play Doh, God. But after Jesus dies, you mush them together. Okay, following the Council of Ephesus, even though a vast majority of the church leaders present at the Council of Ephesus disagreed with Nestorius' teachings, there was still a group of Christians that were located in the Persian Empire, which at this time was ruled by the Sassanids, although I don't think you care about who the fuck the Persian Empire was being ruled by at this time in history. Basically, this group of Christians in the Persian Empire agreed with Nestorius' teachings. They were like, yeah, that's our guy, and he makes total sense to us. And they ended up completely severing themselves from the rest of Christendom forever. And they became the first major denomination to separate themselves from Christianity. So they were originally referred to as the Nestorian Church, named after Nestorius, because Nestorius is simply their guy. But this denomination is now referred to as the Church of the East, and they trace their patriarchal line back to Thomas the Apostle. So this means, stay with me here, this means that according to the Church of the East, Thomas the Apostle was the first patriarch of the Church of the East, making them the one true disciple, no, descendant of Jesus's ministry. Are you following me here with this? This is why the apostolic age is so important, because every denomination is going to look at one of the apostles and they're going to be like, okay, so we're descended from you, which means we are the one true descendant of Jesus's ministry. I do want everyone to remember that there were 12 apostles and they all did the same thing. They all founded churches in different parts of Europe and the Middle East. Anyone could claim that one of the 12 apostles is their first patriarch. There are 12 of them. It would be different if there was one apostle, if there was one guy, and everyone was like, we have clear proof that this one singular apostle came to this rock and made a church. That's different. But there are 12 guys. That aside, according to historians between the 9th and 14th centuries, just to jump forward in the timeline a little bit, the Church of the East at this time was considered to be the largest Christian denomination, not based on like population or anything, but just based on geographical spread, because they had gone as far as establishing communities as far east as like China. Unfortunately, despite like the vast amount of land that they were spread over, the Church of the East was still a relatively small community simply because of persecution in the areas that they were inhabiting. But they were mostly persecuted by the Mongols because I guess the Mongols didn't really like their vibes. I either forgot to look up why the Mongols didn't like the Church of the East Christians, or I simply didn't care enough to put it in my notes. But either way, the Mongols really didn't like the Church of the East, and by the 15th century, there were only 7 known cities with a resident bishop of the Church of the East. So RIP to them. They're still around, by the way. So not RIP, but like totally RIP. So the next major schism occurred in 451 CE following the Council of Chalcedon, about 100 years after the Council of Ephesus. So the Council of Ephesus was the fourth ecumenical council, and it was convened in order to reassert the decision made at the Council of Ephesus, which, as we just talked about, the Council of Ephesus denounced Nestorius's teachings of Christology and Eutychus's teachings of Christology. Oh, I didn't mention Eutyches. That was on purpose. Eutyches was a monk from Constantinople, and his version of Christology was the opposite of Nestorius's teachings. So, whereas Nestorius thought that Jesus's divine and human natures were entirely separate, Eutyches thought that Jesus was all divine and that he did not have a human nature at all. Let me just remind people, Nestorius thought that Jesus was born a dude, died a dude, and then when he resurrected, he was a god. Eutyches over here, on the other hand, thinks that Jesus was just a god the entire time. According to historians, however, just to throw a wrench into these things, the assertion by Eutyches that Jesus was all divine and no human may have actually been false, because according to surviving records, Eutyches himself didn't actually believe any of his teachings, which is kind of embarrassing. Whether or not this is actually true, we don't know, but historians speculate that the reason Eutyches may or may not have believed in his own teachings can be traced back to one singular line from his teachings that he actually pulled from another guy named Cyril of Alexandria. There is only one physis, since it is the incarnation of God, the Word. Historians think that Cyril, whom Eutyches claimed to be a follower of, confused the meaning of the Greek word physis for the Latin word persona, meaning person. So the line with this Latin translation could say, there is only one person, since it is the incarnation of God, the Word. And in simpler language, this sentence basically means that Jesus Christ is the only incarnation of God. There is only one incarnation, it is Jesus Christ. That is the simple translation of the sentence. Greek theologians have typically translated the word physis to mean nature. So with the Greek translation, the line would be, there is only one nature, since it is the incarnation of God, the Word. And the simple translation of that sentence is just, any incarnation of God is divine. They are only divine. God can only be divine, even his incarnations. Divinity is awesome, right? So with that in mind, Cyril and by extension Eutyches may have actually been teaching the opposite of what they intended. But regardless of their intentions, I guess many people at the time believed that Eutyches was advocating for the Christological doctrine called Docetism, which was the belief that the historical and bodily existence of Jesus Christ was more of an illusion than reality, i.e., Jesus Christ didn't have a real body. He was just projecting an image of a physical form into people's minds. Does that make sense? So, like, Jesus wasn't fully human, he just appeared human. All this being said, the Council of Chalcedon issued the Chalcedonian definition, which reaffirmed that Jesus Christ had two natures in one person and that those two natures were totally complete. The kicker here is that this ruling caused a major schism, and this was referred to as the Chalcedonian Schism, in which the group that rejected the Chalcedonian definition, referred to now as the Oriental Orthodox Church, they broke away from the Imperial Roman Church because they believed that the description of Jesus Christ as one person with two natures was synonymous with Nestorianism. Do I understand this logic? Not really, but we're going to try and get into it. The Oriental Orthodox Church thought that the Chalcedonian definition was hypocritical and that the acceptance of the Chalcedonian definition was tantamount to eventually accepting Nestorianism. Because Nestorianism, if you recall from like 5 minutes ago, Nestorianism believes that Jesus Christ was two different natures at two different times. He was born a human, he died a human, he was resurrected as a god, right? Those are two different natures at two different times. The Chalcedonian definition is basically saying that Jesus Christ does in fact have two natures. He is both divine and human, but at the same time. That's the difference that's the difference I'm understanding between the Chalcedonian definition and Nestorianism. The Oriental Orthodox Church is basically equating the two. I guess they just don't know how to fucking read. To me, it makes sense. To me, there's a clear distinction between the two. The Catholic Church is arguing that there are two natures at once. The Nestorian Church, or the Church of the East, is arguing that there are two different natures at two different times. I think, hey, I think the Oriental Orthodox Church at this time, in this moment, they were not reading between the lines. They simply were not using their critical thinking. Maybe that's just me being a bitch. I think it's pretty easily understood. So, as they rejected the Chalcedonian definition, the Oriental Orthodox Church put forth Miaphysite Christology, which is the belief that Jesus Christ was both 100% divine and 100% human in one single person without the mingling or alteration of either natures in their communion. This doesn't make sense to me. The Church of the East Christology is basically saying that at the time of his human birth and human death, Jesus Christ is 100% human, 0% divine. But at the time of his resurrection, he is 100% divine, 0% human, right? The Christology of the Catholic Church is arguing that he is 50% divine, 50% human. This equals 100%, right? The goal is always to get to 100%. The Oriental Orthodox Church is arguing actually he's 100% divine, but also 100% human, but also there's no intermingling of the two. So not only are we getting to 200%, but it's basically like the divine parts of him and the human parts of him are like battling control over the body. Or at least that's what I'm getting from this. That's what my mind is conjuring up, okay? And this doesn't really make any sense to me, but I'm just going to let it go and I'm going to let them live their lives because it's really not about me and whether or not I understand their specific way of thinking. But how are we getting to 200%? We should not be getting to 200%. So, anyways, now we have the Oriental Orthodox Church, and as one of the oldest branches of Christianity, the Oriental Orthodox Church considers itself to be, say it with me, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Jesus Christ, not one of the apostles, Jesus Christ himself through the Great Commission. They also believe that their bishops are the direct successors of the apostles. Which apostles? All of them. Their bishops are the direct descendants of every single apostle, all 12 of them, in fact. So they're really special. At some point after splitting from the Imperial Roman Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church was in communion with the Church of the East, which doesn't really make sense to me. Why would you do that if you really don't like Nestorius' teachings? And the whole point of the Church of the East is that they broke apart from the Imperial Roman Church because they liked Nestorius' teachings. Make it make sense to me. But anyways, they were in full communion with the Church of the East for a while until 484 CE at the Synod of Beth Lapet. The Synod at of Beth Lepet was a local council of the Church of the East in which the church officially accepted the doctrines of Nestorius. So that's why they were not in communion after that point, because the Oriental Orthodox Church hates Nestorius, and the Church of the East loves him. How they even got into communion with each other in the first place, I don't understand it, but I love the drama nevertheless. Okay, so now we're getting to the juiciest schism of all. This is the East-West Schism of 1054 CE, when the Western Church split from the Eastern Church permanently. But before we actually talk about the schism itself, let's speed run some of the disputes that preceded the formal split, because unlike the other two that we just talked about, it's not one singular thing that made them split apart. It's a lot of things over many, many, many centuries. They didn't like each other for a long time. It took them so long to break up. Okay, so the first dispute is in regards to the Nicene Creed, specifically in regards to the procession of the Holy Spirit. What does this mean? So, in the original Nicene Creed, which was, as I said, written as a result of the First Council of Nicaea, but it was finished during the First Council of Constantinople. Do I have dates for those? No, I don't. This was in 381 AD, CE. I don't like using AD. The Holy Spirit is said to proceed, quote, from the Father. Okay, what the fuck does this mean? The line itself is, and in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified. So the dispute arose in the late 6th century when some churches in the West added the words "and from the Son," or filioque, as it is in Latin, to the description of the procession of the Holy Spirit, so that the Nicene Creed could then be read as, "And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified." The Eastern Church did not like this, and they argue that not only does adding the term filioque drastically alter one's understanding of the Trinity itself, but it also violates canon number 7 of the Council of Ephesus, which states that, quote, "It is unlawful for any man to bring forward or to write or to compose a different faith as a rival to that established by the Holy Fathers assembled with the Holy Ghost in Nicaea." Basically, it is illegal to change the Nicene Creed, because the Nicene Creed is the number one law of Christianity. We cannot change it. Once it is written down, it is cemented in stone. The Western churches were like, oh, fuck that. So that's the first dispute. The second dispute is in regards to the usage of leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist. So originally, both the churches of the East and the West used leavened bread, which basically means that they had yeast in their bread, like the bread had risen. It's bread. But around the 6th century, the Western Church started using unleavened bread, or bread that was flat, that didn't have any yeast, and they used unleavened bread as a way to closely associate themselves with the Last Supper, because it's believed that they used unleavened bread at the Last Supper because the Last Supper occurred during Passover, and you're not allowed to use yeast during Passover. I'm not Jewish. I'm really sorry if this is wrong. The Eastern churches continued to use leavened bread because in the Byzantine Empire, which is where the Eastern Church was, do you know how like the Roman Empire split into the Western Empire and then the Eastern Empire? Yeah, so the Western Empire are the guys who are using the unleavened bread. The Eastern Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, is basically synonymous with the Byzantine Empire. And while the Western Roman Empire fell at like 400 CE, something like that, the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire didn't fall until like 1400 CE, something like that, 1200. It's around that era, but they were around for a long time. So anyways, the Eastern churches in the Byzantine Empire, they used leavened bread because they believed that unleavened bread was associated with lifelessness, and leavened bread could be associated with the resurrection. So they were like, why the fuck would we use flat bread if flat bread equals death? So the third dispute had to do with the worship of icons, and I don't mean fucking Lady Gaga, I mean like statues. The word icon comes from the Greek word ikonos, and they are sacred images representing religious figures such as saints, Jesus, the Virgin Mary. I'm sure you've seen icons if you've ever engaged with religious media. The purpose of these icons was to give people something physical and tangible to direct their devotion and veneration to, so that they weren't just praying to the air. They could pray to like a figure of Jesus on the cross and be like, hey, God, help. So the controversy stems from the fear that the viewer was misdirecting their veneration towards the image itself rather than the holy figure the image represented. And it was a fear that Christians were committing idolatry by worshiping these icons, especially since the prohibition of worshiping idols was one of the most sacred laws of the Ten Commandments. I think it's literally like the second commandment, like you shall not have false idols or whatever. But this fear arose the iconoclasm debate. Iconoclasm is a Greek term that literally means image breaking, and it refers to the recurring historical impulse to break or destroy images of religious or political figures for religious or political reasons. For example, once Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, many Christians defaced or destroyed statues of the pagan god. That is a form of iconoclasm. Likewise, during the French Revolution, images of the aristocracy and nobility were defaced by the rebels and the peasants. That is a form of iconoclasm. So those in the West who opposed the worshiping of icons, they are known as iconoclasts. They cited the second commandment as a reason why images should not be worshipped in the place of religious figures. Those in the East who supported the worship of icons, who are known as iconophiles, they argued that while God had prohibited the worshiping of images, God had also mandated in the Old Testament scriptures the creation of images in certain instances so that people were able to see who they were worshiping, essentially. So the fourth dispute is in regards to Charlemagne's coronation as emperor of the Romans in 800 CE. Do we know Charlemagne? He was king of the Franks, and then he conquered, if not all, then most of Western Europe, and he turned everyone into Christians, and if they refused to become Christians, then he had them killed. That's simply what Charlemagne did. He named himself Emperor of the Romans in 800 CE, and this is problematic because at this time, the Western Roman Empire has been gone for about 300 years, but the Eastern Roman Empire was still standing. Remember, I gave this whole speech like 2 minutes ago. It's the Western Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, right? Charlemagne, who had conquered most of Western and Central Europe by this time, he declared himself the Emperor of the Romans, also known as the Holy Roman Emperor. In doing so, he essentially laid claim to the former Roman Empire, but he didn't lay claim to the entire Roman Empire. Like both East and West, he only laid claim to the Western Roman Empire. And this is problematic because in not claiming the Eastern Roman Empire, he is basically disowning the Eastern Roman Empire. Byzantines at this time, they still refer to themselves as Romans. They still saw themselves as being descended directly from the Romans. And Western sources following Charlemagne's coronation denied the Byzantines their Roman ancestry and instead referred to them as Greeks. If you know anything about classical antiquity, the Greeks and the Romans were really different from each other. So instead of first conquering the Eastern Roman Empire and then declaring himself the Emperor of the Romans, Charlemagne, kind of in some opinions, is basically usurping the imperial throne that rightly belonged to the members of the Eastern Roman Empire. Like he's basically saying, okay, I am emperor of the Roman Empire, and those guys over there, they are nothing. So from 800 CE until like 1453 CE, which was when the final Byzantine emperor Constantine the 11th died and the Eastern Roman Empire fell to the Ottoman Empire, there were two different Roman imperial lineages, one in the east, obviously, and one that started with Charlemagne. The western line that came from Charlemagne ended in 1806 as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, so it lasted about 400 years longer than the Eastern imperial line. But still, For about 600 years, there were two different empirical lines that claimed direct descent from Rome. So the fifth dispute is in regards to papal supremacy, which means that the Pope enjoys, by divine institution, supreme, full, immediate, and universal power in the care of souls. This basically means that the Pope can do whatever he wants and he has ultimate power and he is in charge of every Christian in the entire world. This Catholic doctrine stems from the idea that the papal position was instituted by Christ and that the papal succession in Rome can be directly traced back to Peter the Apostle because Peter was the one that first founded the Church of Rome. It's also worth noting that Peter is also considered to be like the most important of the apostles because he's the one that I think he was the one that in one of the gospels he first acknowledged that Jesus Christ was Messiah, and then in also the gospels he also denied Jesus 3 times at Jesus's crucifixion. I read the gospels. I know what I'm talking about. Why am I acting like I don't? Peter is regarded by Western Christians as the most important and most authoritative disciple, and the authority of position is derived from the confession of Peter when, after Peter acknowledges that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So basically, Christians have taken this as, okay, Jesus Christ literally told Peter the apostle that he's going to be the one to found the church. Eastern Christians disagree with papal supremacy for many reasons, but the main reasons are: one, the apostles were totally equal. There was no hierarchy within the apostles themselves. Like, Jesus Christ did not rank the apostles in order of best to worst. And honestly, the only reason that Jesus said all of that at the confession of Peter is because Peter was the one who said, "Oh, you're the Messiah." I think that if any other apostle had said, "Oh, you're the Messiah," Jesus would have said the exact same thing, but I digress. So the apostles were all equal. Two, Rome is one of many apostolic thrones. It is not the apostolic throne, meaning there is no reason why Rome should be the number one apostolic throne. It's not the only one that was founded by an apostle. It shouldn't be the apostolic throne. And three, although Rome does have primacy amongst all of the other apostolic seats, that designation is merely a position of honor and it grants no magisterial authority or power. Like, you do not get anything because you have primacy. It's just meant to be something you say thank you and then you move on, right? The sixth and final dispute is the place of the seat of Constantinople in relation to the Pentarchy. Now, the Pentarchy refers to the 5 patriarchs of the early church, each of which sat at and oversaw one of the major cities of the early church. So those are Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So many Eastern Christians believe that Constantinople, not Rome, should have primacy in the church due to the fact that Constantine the Great, after he had decriminalized Christianity in the Roman Empire and had forcibly just stopped the persecution of Christians throughout the empire. I think he converted to Christianity as well, but I can't remember. After he had done all this, he also transferred the Roman Empire seat of power from Rome to Constantinople in 324 CE. So from 324 CE onwards, Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire, not Rome. But the reason why Rome has primacy in the Pentarchy is because the Church of Rome was founded by Peter the Apostle, as we mentioned before, whereas the Church of Constantinople was not founded by any apostle at all. There were 12 apostles. None of them founded the Church of Constantinople. If you want to ascribe a person to it, I guess we could say that Constantine the Great was the one that founded the Church of Constantinople, not one of the apostles, right? The only reason why the Church of Constantinople is ranked second in terms of preeminence in the Pentarchy is because it was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, but Rome gets primacy within the Pentarchy because it was directly founded by Peter the Apostle. So those are some of the main problems leading up to the East-West Schism, and ultimately the East-West Schism is not caused by one single event, as you've probably guessed. It's caused by a variety of cultural differences and misunderstandings that festered for centuries. However, there is a reason why scholars use 1054 CE as the date for when the West and the East split for good, and I'm just going to tell you that story right now. So, Michael I Cerularius was named the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in 1043 CE. Pope Leo IX was named head of the Catholic Church in 1049 CE. The two of them So Michael I Cerularius was named the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in 1054. Nope. So Michael I Cerularius was named the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople in 1043 CE. Pope Leo IX was named the head of the Catholic Church in 1049 CE. So the two of them began arguing over theological and cultural differences almost immediately. So a little bit of background: in the 1040s, Norman warriors from the west conquered southern Italy, which at the time was under Byzantine rule, and they replaced many of the eastern bishops with western bishops, leading to changes in liturgy, the laws of clerical marriage, days of fasting, etc. Like, they changed all of the rules from eastern rules to western rules. In 1052 CE, Cerularius closed all of the Latin churches in Constantinople, i.e., all of the churches that followed Western tradition. He then instructed Archbishop Leo of Ohrid to write a letter to Leo IX, Pope Leo IX, attacking the Western Church's use of unleavened bread and the issue of papal supremacy, amongst other things. Then, in September 1053 CE, Leo IX sent a letter addressed to both Cerularius and Archbishop Leo of Ohrid, in which he cites the donation of Constantine as the reason why the seat of Rome has primacy in the Pentarchy. However, the donation of Constantine is a forged Roman imperial decree in which Constantine the Great transferred full authority over Rome and the Western Roman Empire to the Pope, thereby granting supremacy over the church seats of the Pentarchy and the world. The world at this point is Europe and the Middle East, and then Northern Africa, and then also maybe China. The donation of Constantine is believed to have been composed in the 8th or 9th century for the purpose of legitimizing papal supremacy. Again, we have to legitimize the papal supremacy, but presumably a lot of people, even at the time, were aware that this was not a real document. Like, this was not written by Constantine the Great himself, because it was never mentioned in any documentation prior to the 8th century. So this is not real. Leo IX, in his letter to Cerularius, cited a large portion of the donation of Constantine either because he believed the document to be entirely genuine or because he just wanted the upper hand over Cerularius. Regardless, he uses the donation of Constantine as proof that the seat of Rome, and thereby he himself, should have supreme authority in the church, no questions asked. Leo IX then also accused Constantinople of historically being the center of many heresies. In early 1054 CE, Cerularius responded to Leo IX in another letter. Do I know the contents of this letter? No, I do not. But I do know that Cerularius claimed the title Ecumenical Patriarch for himself, and he also addressed Leo IX as brother rather than father, which would have been the correct terminology when referring to the Pope. Like, the Pope is, for all intents and purposes, the father of the church, essentially. Like, he's the leader of the church, he's the father of the church, right? Calling him brother instead of father is basically Cerularius's way of disowning and demoting the Pope. In response to this letter, Leo IX sent Cardinal Humbert and a couple of other guys that are not as important as Cardinal Humbert as ambassadors to Constantinople. However, soon after arriving in Constantinople, Cardinal Humbert and the other envoys received word that Leo IX had died on April 19, 1054 CE, meaning that they no longer had any papal jurisdiction in Constantinople. Their authority immediately ended after the Pope's death. They couldn't do anything in Constantinople and claimed that they were doing it on behalf of the Pope because the Pope was dead. So what were they going to do? If you're Cardinal Humbert, you are going to decide to still engage in open dispute with Cerularius, even though your number one backer is dead. So on Saturday, July 16th, 1054 CE, Cardinal Humbert walked into the Hagia Sophia, which was the religious and spiritual center of the Byzantine Empire at the time. He did this during the divine liturgy, and then he placed a charter of excommunication directed against Cerularius and his followers directly on top of the altar before walking out. So Humbert excommunicated the entire Eastern churches from the Western churches on the behalf of a pope that was already dead. Do you understand the drama? Okay, it gets even better. 4 days after this happened, Cerularius decided to excommunicate Humbert, his colleagues, and all of their supporters from the Eastern Roman Empire. However, this excommunication from Cerularius had no explicit mention of either the entire Western Church or the Church of Rome. It was only directed at Humbert, his colleagues, and their supporters. Now, I do want to say, before we move on, this is stupid. I think it's stupid on everyone's part. First of all, Humbert, like I said before, had no authority in Constantinople once Leo died. What did he think was going to happen when he excommunicated the entire Eastern Roman Empire? Also, why the fuck? I understand why Cerularius responded with his own excommunication, but why would you give it the time of day if Humbert's initial excommunication was illegitimate? It was not a real excommunication, so why would you give it the airtime? Like I said before, there was no definitive event or formal declaration indicating exactly when the East and West split. And in fact, the mutual excommunication that I just told you about was so unserious that contemporary historians considered the event to be extremely insignificant. And it's only cited now, like in the modern period, as the reason why the East and the West split is because there was never a definitive date for when the East and the West split. Like there was never a clean answer. And many modern historians view the 1054 date more as a date of convenience rather than an actual indicator of when things went wrong. As I've mentioned, the East and the West had so many problems that have been going on for centuries. There was never going to be a singular date that you could pinpoint as the date that the East and the West split forever. And honestly, even after this excommunication, they didn't actually split forever. Like, it was never as strict as when the Church of the East or the Oriental Orthodox Church split from the Imperial Church. Because in terms of East and West, it always had more to do with the powers that be butting heads with each other than ordinary Christians in the East and the West having disputes. Like, allegedly, these ordinary Christians in the East and the West weren't even aware that a mutual excommunication had occurred. They weren't even aware that disputes were really happening. And as noted by a modern Eastern Orthodox bishop named Callistos Huare, quote, even after 1054, friendly relations between East and West continued. The two parts of Christendom were not yet conscious of a great gulf of separation between them. The dispute remained something of which ordinary Christians in East and West were largely unaware. This was not a problem to them, but the leaders of the Eastern Church and the Western Church had so much major beef between them that they could not remain in communion with each other. But like, even though the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is what the Western churches and the Eastern churches ended up becoming respectively, even though they taught their respective followers that their church is the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church established by Jesus during the Great Commission and descending directly from the apostles, that they alone continue to practice the original Christian faith and whatnot, the two denominations have always been on pretty good terms for the most part. And there have been a couple of times where their respective leaders have attempted to heal the rift and reunite the East and the West. I think the most recent attempt was in 2016. I think Pope Francis made an attempt. I don't know if it went anywhere, but there was an attempt, and there's no fighting involved. But obviously, as time went on and as cultures and nations shifted and whatnot, that divide did become clearer and clearer and clearer. Still, it was the East-West schism, juicy as fuck. Not really a schism. Okay, and we're back. So yes, I am filming this section an entire month. I think it's actually been 2 months now since I filmed the last section. So yeah, we're just gonna dive right in. You're also gonna notice that I'm standing this time instead of sitting down. That's simply because I don't want to sit anymore. I'm tired of sitting. The funny thing about working in corporate is that you have to sit on your ass like 9 hours of the day, and it's actually awful. And obviously, I don't like standing in one place for very long, but unfortunately, I do need to stand or else I will lose control of my legs. So we're going to be standing for this video, and it's going to be super awesome. So the next major event and the next major schism that we're going to be talking about is the Protestant Reformation. And I swear to fucking God, the Protestant Reformation is my worst enemy, and we're going to get into why. But I do want to say first that the initial purpose of the Protestant Reformation, I totally get it. I totally agree with it. I'm like 100% here for it, you know? Everything else that happens afterwards within Protestantism pisses me off to no end. We're mostly going to be talking about the actual Reformation itself and less about the ripple effect that it had on Western Europe and also in North America. We could talk about the ripple effects. I don't want to. Okay, so like the split that occurred between the East and the West in 1050 CE, the Protestant Reformation was a conflict that had been slowly building for many, many years, and most of the problems stemmed from the common people's dissatisfaction with the authority and the teachings of the clergy. And the clergy are the guys like the priests, the bishops, the deacons, the Pope especially. Like, these were the guys who had authority in the church, and they basically interpreted the scriptures for common people. This dissatisfaction with the clergy was exacerbated by a lot of things, mostly by the popularity of the humanist movement and the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. So to address the former, the humanist movement, and connecting it to the Reformation, humanism was a facet of the Renaissance period because we're kind of getting out of the Renaissance period at this point. Like, we're just shifting away from whatever the fuck the Renaissance was doing, right? So humanism was a facet of the Renaissance period that sought to revive the cultural heritage, literary legacy, and moral philosophy of the Greco-Roman civilization. So it's also during the humanist period that the donation of Constantine, which we talked about previously, is proved to be a forged document, thereby ultimately threatening the authority of the papacy. So this ties to our second issue, which is the invention of the printing press. Because prior to this, books needed to be copied by hand in order for there to be multiple copies of a text. And these texts were typically copied by Christian monks, and they were copied in Latin. The reason they were copied into Latin is because at this time, the official language of the church was Latin. Typically, these books were religious literature, which was largely inaccessible to the common people, the majority of the population, the Christian population, because the common people were not educated to read and understand Latin. So not only did the printing press allow for more people to just possess religious literature, it also encouraged translations of the Bible to be printed. So between 1466 and 1492, the Bible was translated into many languages in Eastern Europe. Not Eastern Europe, Western Europe. These languages were High and Low German, Italian, Dutch, Spanish, Czech, Catalan, and French. So because common people could read the Bible in their native tongues, they were able to interpret and ultimately challenge and debate with the priests, with the clergy, regarding their teachings about the scriptures, which ultimately diminished the authority of the clergy. And another thing that helped to diminish the authority of the clergy was the constant fear of unexpected death that came about first in the aftermath of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, and then at the end of the 15th century when syphilis spread throughout Europe for the first time. So people were just falling around dying. They were just dropping dead, dying because of an illness that they couldn't explain, that they perceived to be a punishment sent by God. This fear of an unexpected death caused a lot of people to worry about what would happen to their souls once their body died. So at this time, the Catholic Church taught that in order for one's soul to ascend to heaven, it wasn't enough to just have faith in God. One must also perform good deeds, and they must lead a life without sin. Unfortunately, committing a sin is way more commonplace than performing good deeds due to this pesky thing that we call original sin. But this begs the question, what happens to a soul that is intrinsically embedded with sin? Like, do they go to hell and experience eternal punishment? The answer is probably yes if you are I don't know, listening to whatever the fuck the clergy is telling you. If you are riddled with original sin and your life is just full of committing sinful deeds that maybe you're not even trying to commit, then yeah, you're gonna go to fucking hell, okay? So obviously people didn't want to go to hell. Like, that's just not the thing that they want to do. So in order to rectify this, the Catholic Church established indulgences. Indulgences were ways to reduce the amount of punishment one had to undergo in the afterlife for their sins. Because this is a real thing. This is something that just makes total sense. Like, you can receive an indulgence in your earthly life, and in receiving that indulgence, you are lessening your sentence in hell. It's like hell is a prison sentence, and if you do enough good deeds, then you can knock off a few years off your prison sentence. Except the thing about prison is that it is on this earthly mortal coil, and it makes sense that on this earthly mortal coil, you can knock off time off of your prison sentence, because that's a thing that you can actually control, because this is a thing called life. In death, you don't really have that power, but the Catholic Church is telling people that they do have the power to lessen your prison sentence in hell. So the way for someone to receive an indulgence, there's a few ways that someone could receive an indulgence. They could say a specific prayer a certain amount of times, they could go on a pilgrimage, or they could perform a specific good deed or work. They are specific because a member of the clergy has to give them this task. The clergyman has to look at the common people and be like, if you want an indulgence, you have to say the Hail Mary 5 times, or you have to feed the hungry for the rest of the week, right? Like 3 meals a day, go feed the hungry right over there on that street. And if you do that for a week, then you will have this indulgence. So basically, if you feel that you have done evil in your life, which everyone has done, you can reverse that evil by doing good, by performing an act of good. Another way that one can receive an indulgence is by almsgiving. And almsgiving is basically when you donate money or clothing or any other like material good to the impoverished or directly to a charity. So by the beginning of the 16th century, indulgences were largely used to support charities, i.e., common people would give money to the clergy, and then that money was supposed to go to a charity, like a specific charity, and in exchange, the common person gets an indulgence for giving the clergy their money, aka giving the charity their money, right? Okay, the problem with this is that some clergy members who were specifically tasked to collect alms for a specific charity began to abuse the sale of indulgences. And by that, I mean they would extract the maximum amount of money that they could swindle out of the common people, and they would keep a significant portion of those funds for themselves so that they can fund their like personal expensive projects. And then the rest of the money that they received from the poor people would go to the charities, right? So let's say you give the clergyman like $100, right? The clergyman who is corrupt and evil and abusing the sale of indulgences is going to keep $90 of your 100 for themselves so they can put that towards their fund of like buying a Maserati, right? And then the other $10 of that 100 is going to go to the charity. But the most important thing is they want to buy their Maserati. They want to fund the crusades, right? So these clergymen who were swindling money out of the common people in the name of indulgences, they became known as the pardoners. And the way that they got common people to continue to give them money is by promising them indulgences that lasted hundreds or thousands of years. So like the clergymen were giving the common people these like little slips of paper that basically said like, this little piece of paper cuts off 1,000 years off of your prison sentence, which is like kind of fucked up, because typically if you're not a corrupt clergyman doing the Lord's work and you're taking the money and you're actually giving it to the charity, these indulgences, the quote unquote good ones, there are no good indulgences, but the quote unquote good ones, they would last like, oh, at most a year. You know, they would cut off a year at most of someone's prison sentence. The least is like 3 weeks, right? This is normal because they want people to continue doing good works. So if people continue doing good works, they're going to keep getting these 3-week long indulgences, you know, that will cut off 3 weeks of their prison sentence each time. So they're going to keep doing the good deeds, and they're going to keep getting 3 weeks cut off of their prison sentence. If you give somebody an indulgence that cuts off 1,000 years off their prison sentence, that's basically saying, okay, you've done your good deed. Now you can just like continue to be evil and it'll be fine. Okay, and then this is when Martin Luther enters the scene. Not Martin Luther King Jr. This predates him by about 400 years. I'm talking about Martin Luther. He was a German priest, he was a professor of moral theology, and he was a friar of the Order of St. Augustine. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses, or Disputation on the Power and Efficacy of Indulgences, to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. Wittenberg, if you read Shakespeare like I do, is the place where Hamlet goes to college. So the writing of the 95 Theses was in response to Pope Leo X encouraging the sales of indulgences in order to fund the completion of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which had been in construction for decades at this point. Or no, not decades, it's a singular decade. It's been in construction for a singular decade, and Pope Leo X is like, I'm going to finish the reconstruction of the St. Peter's Basilica. Spoiler alert, Pope Leo X is not going to be the Pope who finishes reconstruction on St. Peter's Basilica, but that actually isn't the point of this. I will say before we continue that there are some scholars who do not use October 31st, 1517 as the start of the Protestant Reformation, because as I said before, the Protestant Reformation was a conflict that has been building for a long time before Martin Luther came on the scene. We're using the 1517 date as the start of the Reformation, not as like a hard start, but just kind of like a soft landing point, just because this is kind of when all that Protestant stuff becomes like a major problem for the Pope specifically. Okay, so because Pope Leo X wanted to finish reconstruction on St. Peter's Basilica, he appointed Archbishop of Magdeburg Albert of Brandenburg to supervise the sale of indulgences in Germany. But it wasn't Albert necessarily who offended Martin Luther, rather it was the Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel who applied aggressive marketing tactics while selling indulgences. And he was the one who allegedly invented the slogan, as soon as the coin into the box rings, a soul from purgatory to heaven springs. I think that's kind of awesome. That's a baller line. It's also incredibly fucked up. Because, like, if you're telling people that giving money to the church will free a soul from purgatory or hell, then yeah, they're gonna give you money. That's so smart. Unfortunately, he's incredibly evil, but he's kind of a genius for this one. In his 95 Theses, Martin Luther opposed the abuse and corruption of the church by Catholic clergy, especially the clergymen who sold indulgences. So he proposed that rather than focusing on external sacraments such as praying or giving to the poor in order to forgive one of one's sins, one should instead turn their attention to cleansing their spirit, like becoming like an inwardly good person rather than focusing on how you look externally. He also argued that the buying and selling of indulgences allowed for Christians to avoid true repentance for their sins, thus ultimately discouraging Christians from performing genuine and sincere acts of mercy. So yeah, this makes sense, because if you're telling a bunch of Christians that the only way for them to have their sins forgiven and their souls cleansed is to like go out into the world and do good things, they're going to do those good things because they have an ulterior motive, not because they actually care for other human beings. So it's not until the following year, 1518, when Martin Luther begins presenting his teachings and his views on the justification of faith alone. This is a doctrine that a lot of Protestants will adhere to from this point on. And it basically asserts that faith in God alone is enough to cleanse believers of their sins, right? Like you don't have to do any external stuff in order to be forgiven. As long as you have faith in God, you're going to go to heaven, baby. Okay? It's at this point that Pope Leo X decides to retaliate, but he doesn't do a very good job of it. Let me tell you why. Many of his supporters are telling him to excommunicate Martin Luther from the church, right? They're like, you have to kick him out of the church. You have to kick him out of Europe, essentially, before his ideas continue to spread. Pope Leo X refuses to excommunicate Martin Luther because Martin Luther has a very powerful patron named Frederick the Wise, who is the Prince Elector of Saxony. This is important because a Prince Elector was a member of the Electoral College that elected the Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor at this point is, I think, Charles VII. I have it written down later in the script, but it's Charles VII. Pope Leo X and Charles VII do not like each other. I think the Holy Roman Emperor basically has the Electoral College on his side. So if he angers Frederick the Wise, then word is going to get back to Charles VII and something drastic is going to happen. Also, Frederick the Wise is like incredibly wealthy. And the church at this point loves money. So they don't want to excommunicate Martin Luther because they don't want to lose Frederick the Wise's support and his money. So instead of excommunicating Martin Luther, Pope Leo X decides to send Cardinal Thomas Cajetan to Germany under strict orders to convince Martin Luther to withdraw and renounce his theses, like to stop teaching his viewpoints, to agree with the Catholic Church, basically. And according to theologian Bernd Ham, it was at this meeting that was, quote, the historical point at which the opposition between the Reformation and Catholicism first emerged, because allegedly, Cardinal Cajetan had deemed Martin Luther and all of his followers as being beyond clerical guidance. So officially, this is the point in history we can decide, okay, so this is when like the split actually occurred, right? The 95 Theses was the breaking point. This is when the split occurs. What followed was a campaign by Luther and several other preachers to spread his teachings throughout Germany. They're still kind of staying in Germany because, again, there's no cars, and there's no trains. It's very difficult to travel at this point. So they're staying kind of local, right? But it's not super local because Pope isn't on it. So they're spreading his teachings throughout Germany, and they did this via the printing press. Very helpful, this printing press. Everyone can, and also like people are becoming educated now, or they're becoming a little educated. They're not like super educated, but they're educated enough that they can read whatever the fuck Martin Luther is printing. And it's speculated that Martin Luther was responsible for approximately 1/5 of all works printed in Germany in the early 16th century. So bitch was writing a lot. Do I actually know the numbers on how much he was writing? No, I don't. Luther and his colleagues at the time were dubbed the evangelicals due to their insistence on teaching in accordance to the Gospels or the good news. And good news, translated into ancient Greek, is the word evangelion. So that's why they're called the evangelicals. So the evangelicals taught that a majority of the well-established church practices, including indulgences and many of the sacraments, had no actual precedent in the Bible, and that clergymen should not be members of the privileged class as they were in Roman Catholicism, but rather they should be servants of the community. And then in his German manifesto, because of course he's writing manifestos, the manifestos called to the Christian nobility of the German nation, by the way. Martin Luther very bravely declared that the papacy could be associated with the Antichrist and that the Holy Seat of Rome was the, quote, worst whorehouse of all whorehouses, in reference to the amount of money the Holy Seat was receiving. I'm sure you don't need me to explain that analogy. I'm sure you understand what happens in a whorehouse, in a brothel. I don't know if there's a politically correct term for whorehouse. I could Google this, but it's not the point of anyways. It was also in this manifesto where he declared that his ultimate goal was to reform the Catholic Church because it had fallen so far from Christ's teachings from the original church that he thought the Catholic Church needed to be reformed, and that he was going to be the one, or he was going to be one of the ones to reform the church. It's why this period is called the Protestant Reformation, because they want to reform the Catholic Church. Ultimately, they just ended up splitting from Catholicism entirely. The Catholic Church is still the same, by the way. It hasn't really changed. They just stopped selling indulgences, which is awesome. So despite the vast popularity of Martin Luther's teachings and the sheer amount of work that was being printed by him, him, the evangelicals faced a lot of resistance throughout Western Europe. Obviously, this makes sense. Catholicism has been the reigning denomination of Christianity in Western Europe since the East-West Schism of 1050 CE. Like, it's been 500 years. People are pretty familiar with Catholicism. One of the biggest supporters of the Catholic Church at this time was King Henry VIII of England, who commissioned a team of theologians to defend Catholic dogma against Martin Luther's attacks in a treatise titled The Assertion of the Seven Sacraments. Was this effective? I don't really know. It was effective enough that Pope Leo X got wind of it, and he gave Henry VIII a fancy title. I didn't write the title down because it doesn't fucking matter, but just know at this point in history, the Pope and King Henry VIII are on good terms. They're not going to be on good terms for very much longer, though. We'll get back to him in a little bit. So now you must be wondering, why are they called Protestants now? How did they become Protestants? Because I've told you that at this point in time, they're called evangelicals, but how did we get to Protestants? Well, it's very stupid. And this is part of the research where I started to get really angry. So in 1522, Albert of the German royal house of I didn't practice saying this before. Hohenzollern. I'm doing a lot glottally. Hohenzollern. I don't think that's correct. How do I pronounce this? In 1522, Albert of the royal German house of Hohenzollern met Martin Luther, and Martin Luther convinced Albert to forego Catholicism and embrace Luther's evangelical teachings. We're still in Germany. Pay attention. This is significant because Albert was the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, which was a Catholic religious institution whose members were historically crusading knights for the Catholic Church during the Crusades. Does that make sense? Like, they fought in the Crusades on behalf of the Catholic Church. Like, that's the whole point of the Teutonic Order of Knights, is that they went to Jerusalem and they tried to go to Jerusalem on. I hope you know what the Crusades are about, or I hope you know the general gist of the Crusades, because I don't know how to explain it to you. Okay, in 1525, after Albert has fully converted to Martin Luther's teachings, we can't call it Protestantism yet, but just know he converted to Protestantism. Albert resigned from his position as the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, and in exchange, he became the first Duke of Prussia. This is the invention of Prussia. Do you know Prussia, the German Polish state that existed for a few hundred years just out of nowhere and then disappeared out of nowhere? It didn't disappear out of nowhere. It fell or whatever. It split. Germany and Poland decided to split. They wanted to be their own thing again. Anyways, he becomes the first Duke of Prussia, and he secularized his new state in an act of open rebellion against the Catholic Church. So now Prussia is Protestant. Awesome. And then in 1526, the territory had adopted or was in the process of adopting the Reformation, leading to the protestation at Speyer. What is the protestation of Speyer, you may ask? Let me tell you. So on April 19th, 1529, 6 princes and representatives of 14 imperial free cities presented the letter of protestation against the imperial diet's decision to ban Martin Luther from the Holy Roman Empire that happened in 1526. So Martin Luther has been excommunicated at this point. He's not in the area, right? Or I don't think he's in the area. I don't actually know what this was about. This part's kind of fuzzy to me because I was angry and it didn't make any sense. But just know that Martin Luther is kind of out of the picture at this point, but all of these guys are writing for Martin Luther. These 6 princes were John the Steadfast, who was Elector of Saxony, George the Pious of Hohenzollern, Ernest the Confessor and his brother Francis Brunswick-Lüneburg, Philip I the Magnanimous, and Wolfgang of Anhalt. These 6 guys became known as the Protestants because they were protesting. I hope you get the correlation. And this is considered to be the birth of Protestantism as we know it. So Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door was the first brick thrown at Stonewall. That is the worst analogy I've ever said in my entire life. I'm so sorry. Okay, awesome. But you know what? We got through most of that section. We got through the big chunk of Protestantism that we need to go through. We got through the history section. And now I'm going to speed run some of the largest denominations of Protestantism. But before we actually do that, I will tell you how Protestantism managed to survive against the Catholic Church. If the massive religious upheaval in Germany wasn't enough to convince a lot of Catholics that the Catholic Church needed major reform, was corrupt from the inside out, it was rotting, okay? Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Then the sack of Rome of 1527 convinced them fully, right? The gist of the sack of Rome is that Charles V, who was simultaneously king of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. Remember earlier when I was talking about the Holy Roman Emperor and how the Holy Roman Emperor and Pope Leo X didn't like each other? Yeah, so I accidentally said Charles VII. That's wrong. It's Charles V. My bad. Sorry. But Charles V at this time, he has massive amounts of power and influence. Like, he's got a lot of allies. People like him. He's also pretty wealthy, given that he is King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor. I think that's unfair. I think once you become Holy Roman Emperor, you have to cede your title, your previous title, to somebody else. You don't just get to be both. You have to pick a struggle. Because Charles V had a lot of power and influence and people liked him, Pope Clement VII, by the way, Pope Leo X, fully dead at this point. Now we have Pope Clement VII. I didn't tell you that. I actually don't know when Pope Leo X died, but he's dead at this point. Pope Clement VII perceived Charles V as a threat. So Pope Clement VII formed an alliance with Francis I of France, who was Charles V's archenemy. Their alliance became known as the League of Cognac. Clement VII then engaged his own imperial army in a war against Charles V and his army, but after the imperial army defeated a section of Charles V's army, there were not enough funds to pay the soldiers. The soldiers, rightfully so, were very upset at this, and 34,000 imperial troops mutinied from the imperial army. And on May 6th, 1527, the traitors plus Charles V's own army sacked Rome. They imprisoned Pope Clement VII until he paid them ransom. They just you know how sacking a city goes. It's not good for anyone. They killed people, they destroyed buildings, they caused mayhem and wreckage. Like, it's not great. Also, Rome is supposed to be this like very powerful, fortified, like very great city. It's this impregnable city that is like the host of like the Holy Spirit or whatever. So you would think that no one's going to be sacking Rome, but then these guys sack Rome. Christians who are still part of like the Catholic Church are like, okay, not super great that I put all of my eggs in this basket. So the sack of Rome in 1527 is very important in European history. Like, it causes a ripple effect that just changes the trajectory of European history, and especially its relationship to Catholicism and Christianity. For our purposes, it led to a permanent power shift away from the Pope and toward the Holy Roman Emperor, because they were fighting for power. And this also contributed to a permanent split between Catholics and Protestants, because Charles V had advocated for calling a church council to discuss the methods of reform that Martin Luther was preaching. And Clement VII told him not to stick his nose in papal business and that they would not be calling a church council, because whatever the fuck Martin Luther was teaching just did not matter at all. But because power shifted away from the Pope to the Holy Roman Emperor, Clement VII was forced to call a church council, but it wasn't convened until 1545, when Clement VII's successor, Pope Paul III, convened the Council of Trent, which had two primary objectives. The first objective was to condemn the principles and doctrines of Protestantism, and the second objective was to enact reform in areas of discipline and administration. So no more indulgences, no more corruptness. We're good again, right? So now, this is the part where I'm going to speed run the major branches of Protestantism as they appear chronologically. And when I say speed run, I mean that I'm going to give you the most grossly overgeneralized summary of these denominations as I possibly can, because I don't want to talk about this any more than I have to. Okay, so the first branch of Protestantism that appears is Lutheranism, named after Martin Luther. And now you might be wondering, why the fuck is the denomination of Protestantism named after the guy that popularized Protestantism? The short answer is that Protestants are doing exactly what Christianity did centuries ago. They're just doing it at like a way more rapid pace. Because, like, you know how the point of this video is that Christianity split into all these denominations over the course of, like, oh, I don't know, centuries. Yeah, well, Protestantism is doing the exact same thing. They're splitting into all of these different denominations over the course of like 20 fucking years or something like that. In reality, it's more like 200 years, but still, they're doing it at a majorly rapid pace for reasons I think are kind of stupid. So Lutheranism advocates for a doctrine of justification by grace alone, through faith alone, on the basis of scripture alone, i.e., what is in the scripture holds more authority than what tradition or the clergy claim. But unlike a lot of other Protestant denominations, Lutheranism still retains many liturgical practices and teachings from the Catholic Church. And they believe that every Christian is predestined for salvation, and that only those who do not believe in God, those are the people who will face eternal damnation. Otherwise, if you are like into God, then you're gonna go straight to heaven. And on the last day of the apocalypse, which is the second coming of Christ, all of the bodies of the dead will be resurrected, and the souls will be returned to the bodies they had before dying, so that they can live with their bodies and souls intact in heaven. I don't think it's like a Big Bang theory and we're just like starting over again. I think it's like, okay, your bodies are going to be resurrected. They're going to come up and we're all going to be happy with our bodies in heaven or something. I think that's what they're talking about. I don't think they're like, okay, we're going to restart the clock and do it all over again, right? Lutherans also believe in monergism, which is the idea that salvation and all matters pertaining to the spirit are exclusive to God alone. Humans do not have free will in these regards. Like, upon this mortal coil, we can do whatever the fuck we want. Like, with physical things, with like material things, we do have free will. When it comes to the spirit, when it comes to the soul, whenever it comes to something that's divine, that's all God, if that makes any fucking sense. I don't know. So the next branch to appear is Reformed Christianity, or Calvinism, which was named after a French theologian named John Calvin. So Calvin was part of a second generation of reformers following Martin Luther's footsteps, and he was among several other theologians who spread Protestant ideas to Switzerland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Between 1536 and 1539, John Calvin wrote Institutes of the Christian Religion, which became the main reference of the doctrine for Calvinism. Like, a lot of the ideas of Calvinism kind of cemented itself, right? Thing about Calvinism is that God has ultimate sovereignty over all things, human and divine, and the scope of God's powers, as well as human beings' relationships to the spiritual world, can be summed up in the 5 points of Calvinism. Those 5 points are total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. So what do these all mean? So total depravity means that as a consequence to humankind's fall from grace, i.e., the whole Adam and Eve situation, every single person is enslaved to sin, therefore making them morally unable to choose faith in God. They cannot do it because they are riddled by sin. You know, like, sin is the antithesis of God, or whatever the fuck he's doing. Unconditional election means that from the beginning of time, God has chosen who will be granted salvation and who will be eternally damned. And he makes these choices purely on a vibe space. He decided before you were even born, before you even existed, whether or not you were going to be saved or damned for the rest of eternity. Limited atonement means that Jesus died on the cross to save only those whom God had divinely selected for salvation. Like, whereas Catholicism believes that Jesus died on the cross to save everyone from their sins, like to fully cleanse every single person of their sins, Calvinism is arguing that Jesus died on the cross to fully cleanse certain people of their sins, the divinely chosen of their sins. Irresistible grace means that once God has decided that you will be saved, once you've been predestined for salvation, you have no choice but to submit to salvation, which is kind of going against the total depravity thing, but I guess in being chosen, you are instantly cleansed of all of that sin. And then perseverance of the saints are those whom God divinely elected to grant salvation, and their spirits will live on in faith until the end. Like, they won't just vanish into ether, like they're going to be part of the divine world forever and ever, I guess. Anabaptism was instigated by a Swiss Christian theologian named Ulrich Zwingli as early as 1522. Anabaptists don't really consider themselves to be an offshoot of Protestantism, but as an offshoot of Christianity itself, because I think, and I might be wrong, Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther met in 1529, and they disagreed on the presence of the Eucharist because Luther believed in the sacramental union of the body and blood to the bread and the wine, like Catholicism, because you remember Lutheranism still retains a lot of like Catholic teachings, especially when it comes to liturgical practices. Zwingli argued against this literal meaning of bread and the blood and the body and the whatever, and he considered that transformation to be purely symbolic. Like, we're not actually eating the body of Christ, we're not actually drinking his blood, it's just bread and wine that we've attributed this importance to. So they disagree on that, and that's why Anabaptists are like, we are not Protestants, and everyone else is like, you are Protestant, but whatever. Anabaptists believe that the path to salvation is not through faith alone, like Lutheranism believes, but through the process of repentance, self-denial, faith rebirth, and obedience, i.e., one must choose to be baptized as an adult. This is a big thing about Anabaptists. They do not like infant baptism. They do not like it when babies are baptized because the baby cannot choose for themselves simply because they're a baby. They believe that the whole point of being baptized is to profess your undying faith. Anabaptists also adhere to a lot of beliefs and practices of early Christianity, especially feet washing, the holy kiss, which is basically just like when you kiss someone in greeting, and then that kiss is supposed to signify a wish of peace and blessings upon the recipient of the kiss, a holy kiss. Head coverings, nonconformity to the world, non-resistance to authority, and communal living. Denominations of Anabaptism include the Amish, Hutterites, and Mennonites. I'm sure if I say Amish, you're gonna get a picture in your head, and you're gonna understand what I'm saying. Okay, and that Anglicanism is the perfect middle ground between Protestantism and Catholicism, because in their practices and teachings, they're still basically Catholic. Like, they're quite close to being Catholic, but the Protestant thing about the Anglicans is that they do not give a fuck about whatever the fuck the Pope is saying. Here's where it starts. Okay, Anglicanism started in 1533 when King Henry VIII of England, I told you he was going to come back. Henry VIII of England, even though he wrote that whole treatise defending Catholic doctrine against Martin Luther, he decides that he does not want to be a part of the Catholic Church anymore because he wants to marry Anne Boleyn and divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, which defies Catholic tradition because Catholics they frown upon divorce. They do not like divorce. And Henry VIII is like, but I want to divorce my first wife because she's old and she's ugly and she can't bear me any more children because she's like 40 at this point. Sorry, Catherine of Aragon, but you did not give Henry a son. Spoiler alert, Anne Boleyn is not going to give Henry a son either, but that's not what this video is about. So anyways, 1533, Henry VIII declares the Church of England as being separate from the Catholic Church. He marries Anne Boleyn, everything's great, and then the next year, through the Act of Supremacy, Henry VIII declares himself as the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively severing ties with the Catholic Church. And it's not until the Elizabethan settlement of 1559, which is named after his daughter Elizabeth I, that the Protestant identity of the Church of England was affirmed. This period between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, when the Church of England was made less Catholic is known as the English Reformation. And the English Reformation is kind of when England becomes Protestant, but it's also when a lot of groups who believe in the Reformation, believe in Protestantism, aren't super thrilled about the direction of Protestantism that the Church of England is going through. Like, there's a lot of people that thought that the Church of England was still too Catholic and that Protestant reforms hadn't gone far enough. So between the 16th and 18th centuries, these people formed their own offshoots of Anglicanism, and there's a lot of them. So we have British Anabaptists, we have Baptists who also believed in only baptizing adults and not baptizing infants, but they baptized by completely immersing the person in water rather than sprinkling water on the person or like pouring water over their head. The Baptists were like, okay, we're going to dunk you. We have Methodists who believe in the rebirth of the human spirit while one is alive and like doing works of piety or whatever. And then we have Puritans who believed that covenant theology was the framework for redemption, works, and grace. Covenant theology is just like God's dealings with mankind, especially the creation, the fall, the redemption, and the second coming. Puritans, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with them because of the Salem witch trials. They were the ones who did the Salem witch trials. I think Christianity as a whole was like not a fan of witches, but the Puritans especially. Puritanism as Puritanism isn't around anymore, but they have kind of changed into Congregationalism. And the last offshoot of Anglicanism that I'm going to mention are the Quakers. And the Quakers believe in reaching perfection, i.e. becoming completely free of sin in your mortal life. And they also believe in sitting in complete silence until the Holy Spirit moves them to say something. By the way, if you haven't figured it out already, basically all of these offshoots, all of these different denominations of Protestantism are basically the same. I'm just telling you the things that make them slightly different from each other, because otherwise I'm going to be just saying the same shit 75 different times. I'm trying to tell you the little things that make them different from each other. Am I successful? Who knows? Okay, and then in the 1830s, Adventism sprung up in America due to the Second Great Awakening, which was basically a revival of Protestant ideals in America. That's kind of the whole thing. Adventists' big thing is that they believe that the second coming of Christ is imminent. Let me tell you, they started in the 1830s. It's been a while, so I don't really know where that second coming of Christ is. I also don't really know what their definition of imminent is. Their theology also differs from the rest of Protestantism because they're thinking about the normal things like having faith in God and like doing your prayers and like living a sinless life or whatever. Like they're thinking about that stuff, but they're also thinking about whether or not people who are between death and eternal afterlife are sleeping, i.e., if their soul upon death is just gone in the ether, just not here anymore, and that our souls are mortal, or whether or not our souls are quote unquote awake and immortal, i.e., our souls are kind of just like somewhere floating around waiting for heaven to open its gates, because presumably heaven's not around until the second coming of Christ, until Jesus comes again, you know? So that's what they're thinking about. Also, they're also thinking about whether the ultimate punishment of the damned is complete annihilation or eternal torture. So they're like kind of insane. And now, before I move on to the last major event of the timeline before we end the video, I do need to tell you why I'm not mentioning Mormonism, because I'm sure you're wondering, hey, why aren't you mentioning Mormonism? Because everyone knows about Mormonism, and everyone's like, oh, okay, so like we're talking about Protestantism, we're going to talk about Mormonism, right? No, we're not actually going to talk about Mormonism, because Mormonism isn't actually an offshoot of Protestantism. It's like entirely its own thing, because whereas Protestantism, all of Protestantism sought to reform the problems of the Catholic Church. They are performing their religion in a way that is different from antiquity, from the Catholic Church, right? Because like the Catholic Church is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in antiquity. These Protestant denominations are like, okay, I hear you, but like we are in the new century now. We have to like think differently. We have to be doing all of these things differently. Whatever you guys are doing is just so antiquated that we cannot follow. That's Protestantism, right? Mormonism believe that what everyone else is doing is completely wrong. Not even just like Catholicism, the rest of Protestantism, but also like the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Church of the East. The Mormon way of faith is a true restoration of the church as it was originally established by Jesus. So I can't talk about Mormonism under the umbrella branch of Protestantism because they're not Protestants. And then you might be wondering, okay, so like why aren't we talking about them as their own section? Like why doesn't Mormonism have a section in the timeline? It's simply because Mormonism, and I might get some hate for this, Mormonism isn't as like important in the grand scheme of things as you might think. Because like Mormonism itself is such a young denomination. Like it only started in like the 19th century or something, but Mormonism also just has like no connection to the rest of Christianity. You could argue that Mormonism does have a connection to the rest of Christianity because it's a denomination of Christianity, but as far as I know, the guy who started Mormonism, I looked on his Wikipedia. His Wikipedia didn't say what denomination of Protestantism his family was. He just kind of started searching for a religion. That's why he started Mormonism, because he was like, which one of these denominations works for me? He didn't like any of them, so he started Mormonism. That split between Christianity and Mormonism is not as intense or impactful or as lasting as the East-West schism of 1050 CE, or the schism that occurred at the Council of Ephesus. Those have historical significance and religious significance. Mormonism just kind of came out of the woodwork, so that's why I'm not talking about it. Okay, now for the final topic of today's video, we are going to be going back to where we started. By that, I mean we are going to be going back to the Church of the East, because it is at this point in 1552 CE, the Church of the East decides that they also need to be having problems. Because they've seen everyone else having problems, they decide it's their turn. So like we've discussed ad nauseum, the Catholic Church is the largest and most powerful religious organization in Western Europe. Are they having a lot of problems? Absolutely. But even though they are having all these problems, we cannot argue against the scope and the sheer size by population of the Catholic Church. So to be in communion with the Catholic Church, even though there is something rotten in the state of Denmark, is to be virtually unstoppable. So let's jump back a little bit. Let's focus back in on the Church of the East. I do want to mention Catholic Church is the only Christian denomination that has a pope. No one else has a pope. It's only the Catholic Church that has the pope, right? I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, all of the other major denominations, barring Protestantism, because Protestantism is doing whatever fucked up thing they're doing, all of the other denominations have patriarchs. Historically, in the Church of the East, each successive patriarch had to be elected to the position of patriarch against a rival. It's kind of like how ideally in a democracy, one would be elected to the presidency against an opponent. You would have one candidate and then you would have the other candidate, and only one of those candidates can be elected to the presidency. It's kind of like that, but again, that's an ideal. So the Church of the East is kind of like that. But around the mid-15th century, Patriarch Shimon IV Basidi changed not only the patriarchal succession, but also the appointment of different ecclesiastical leaders from an elected position to a hereditary position between uncles and nephews. It's between uncles and nephews because when you are elected to one of these positions, you cannot have sex. And once he did this, he named various members of his family to positions of power. And I do want to point out that Shimon IV didn't make a formal declaration that the line of succession would be hereditary rather than elected, but it was a practice that members of his family continued for the next century. So it was not like a legal thing, but it was just something that the rest of his family picked up and continued for the next century, right? In the mid-16th century, Patriarch Shimon VII Ishoyab, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing any of this wrong, by the way. Yikes. Okay, he designated his 12-year-old nephew Kanishol as his successor. This is bad because not only did people not like the position of patriarch was a hereditary position now, and they also especially don't like that the appointed successor is a child. They're not super fond of boy kings. Several years later, presumably because Kanishol died in the interim, Shimon VII named his other nephew, Elia, as his successor. Elia, also a child. This nephew would go on to become Elia the sixth, and he would be the head of what is now referred to as the Elia line, but we're going to get there in a little bit. Hold your horses. It's important to note that nobody liked Shimon the seventh for a variety of reasons. The first is because he kept appointing his child nephews as his successors. No one liked that. Also, the second reason is because he was a whore. According to his opponents, Shimon the seventh permitted concubinage, meaning that he may have had a concubine or two. And if you recall, allegedly, according to his opponents and his rivals, Shimon the seventh permitted concubinage, which basically means that he may or may not have had one or two concubines, or three, or four, or five. Who knows? But if you recall from like a minute ago, patriarchs are not allowed to fuck. Now, Shimon the seventh was so unpopular that rebel clergymen, rebel monks, and rebel church members from 3 different districts in modern-day Turkey and Iran banded together in the region of Mosul, which is in modern-day Iraq, to name a new patriarch. They were like, we need to get rid of this guy because he sucks. We're going to name a new guy. And the guy they chose is named Yohanan Sulakwa, who was the leader of the Rabin Hormizd monastery at the time. Here's the kink in the plan. In order for someone to be formally recognized as patriarch, said person had to be consecrated by a bishop of metropolitan rank, which literally means that they had to be consecrated by a bishop in charge of a very large and very important area. So the team suggested that Yohanan Sulakwa get consecrated by the biggest guy there is at this point, by Pope Julius III in Rome. And this is where things go bad, because if you recall, the Church of the East, they are not friends with Rome, and they haven't been for a while. In Rome, Yohanan Sulakwa made an appeal to Julius III by presenting a letter of support written by his followers in Mosul. The letter says, hey, Shimon the seventh is dead, and this is the guy that we've appointed to be the next patriarch. Please consecrate him. And then Yohanan Sulakwa also makes a profession of faith in the Catholic Church, effectively declaring himself as like in allegiance with Catholicism, right? Satisfied that Yohanan is a good Catholic, Julius III consecrates him as bishop and archbishop on April 9th, 1553, and then he was officially recognized as Shimon VIII Yohanan Sulakwa, the Patriarch of Mosul in eastern Syria, on April 28th. The name Shimon was allegedly adopted as Sulakwa's patriarchal name because it is the classical Syriac version of the name Simon in reference to Simon Peter, the big guy of the apostles. Why did I describe him like that? He's the number one apostle, you know, Apostle Peter, the one who allegedly found the Church of Rome. His name was originally Simon, and then Jesus was like, hey, I'm going to rename you, and your name is going to be Peter now. And it's going to be like, okay, sure, you can do that. And this is basically just a way for Sulakwa to claim a direct lineage to one of the apostles to assert his claim over the patriarchal seat. So this event marks the permanent split in the Church of the East between the Elia line led by Shimon VII's nephew Elia VI and the new line originating from Sulakwa known as the Shimon line, and the birth of the Chaldean Catholic Church. So Sulakwa is the head of the Chaldean Catholic Church. Elia the sixth is in charge of the Church of the East proper. In response to this, Shimon VII, who Julius III believes to be dead, he's fully not, names 2 more underage members of his family, the ruling bishops of important districts. Awesome. And unfortunately for Sulakwa, he was imprisoned and later murdered in early 1555 by an ally of Shimon VII's, so he was not patriarch for very long. But the reason that this conflict lasted for so long is because he had gone into communion with the Catholic Church. The Chaldean Catholic Church is called the Chaldean Catholic Church is because he had taken his sect of the Church of the East and brought it back into communion with the Catholic Church after the Church of the East had been completely separate from Rome for, centuries. So before I go on, I do want to mention that what I just told you is only one version of the events that led to Sulakwa's election as patriarch. The circumstances of the schism that led to the schism have been disputed for centuries, and there are a couple different versions of the story. But the main conflicting story that I'm going to tell you about now has been retold in subsequent histories of this time period and accepted by modern scholars of the Church of the East. Like, the reason that there's still dispute over what actually happened is because so many credible scholars of the time and so many credible scholars now of the Church of the East are like, that is what happened. So that's why the two stories are still in contention. But let me tell you about the other version of the story. So this story is derived from a letter written by a contemporary Catholic priest named Andrew Macias, and according to this letter, the schism of 1552 was caused by the ascension of an 8-year-old boy called Shimon VIII Denha following the death of his uncle, who was the previous patriarch Shimon Bar Mama, in Gazarta 1551. The ascension of this 8-year-old boy led to Sulakwa's election as patriarch once Sulakwa was consecrated as patriarch by Julius III in Rome. Sulakwa's rival patriarch, the 8-year-old boy that eventually died in 1558, 3 years after Sulakwa was canonically murdered. So they were rivals for 2 years, and then the 8-year-old boy outlasted him by 3 years, and then he died. Truly, because he was a child. So the only reason, or not the only reason, the main reason why there's still contention between this version of the story and the first version of the story that I told you about is because this version of the story is recorded in the official Vatican Consistorial Act that recognized Sulakwa as patriarch. And it reads as follows. About 100 years ago, a patriarch tried to make his sacred office hereditary in his family, and every bishop, metropolitan, and patriarch since has been a member of his family. The last patriarch likewise tried to designate as his successor his nephew, whom he had made a bishop and when just a child of 8, but died before he could achieve his aim. The whole nation, priests and laymen alike, resolved to take this heaven-sent opportunity of ending the tyranny and restoring its old right of election. So despite this evidence, there are a few reasons as to why Andrew Macias' statement is false. The main issue is that there is no record that a patriarch died in the city of Gazarta in 1551. The first piece of evidence discounting Macias' claim is that it was customary for patriarchs to be buried at the monastery in Rabban Hormizd in Iraq, and according to scholars, not only is there no tomb for a patriarch that had died in 1551, but there was also no tomb claiming to be the resting place of Shimon Bar Mama, whom Macias claimed to have preceded the 8-year-old boy king. Just a side note, Bar Mama may not actually be the name of a person, but rather a nickname or even a caricature used when talking about Shimon VII, because this name Bar Mama is used in a poem written by Sulakwa's successor, Abdishol IV Maran, who recounted the first version of the story I told you. But in the poem, he's talking about Shimon VII, but he's just calling him Bar Mama. Additionally, scholars have deduced that Macias based the contents of his letter off of another letter that was written by Sulakwa's supporters in 1552, prior to when Sulakwa met Julius III in Rome. So in that letter written by Sulakwa's supporters, they invented the scandal of an 8-year-old boy king succeeding Shimon VII after his quote-unquote death in 1551 in order to bolster the legitimacy of Sulakwa's claims. So like I said, they lied about Shimon VII being dead, and they lied about an 8-year-old boy king succeeding him. Now, if you think this is bad, it's only going to get worse, because the letter written by Sulakwa's supporters talks about an 8-year-old boy king having recently become patriarch, but it doesn't actually reference the recent death of a patriarch. The letter says, 100 years ago, we had a patriarch who would only consecrate a metropolitan from among his own stock, clan, and family, and his family has maintained that custom for the last 100 years. Now only one bishop is left from the family, and he has impudently tried to do the same as his predecessors. But we have refused to accept or proclaim. Regardless of which version of the story you choose to believe, the end result is still the same, because the Catholic Church's recognition of Sulacqua as the legitimate patriarch of the Church of the East led to the Church of the East split into two different factions. The first faction, led by Elia VI, the nephew of Shimon VII, became known as the Elia line of patriarchs, and the second faction, led by Sulacqua, became known as the Shimun line of patriarchs. So not only did Sulacqua's consecration as patriarch begin a new patriarchal line, he was also the first patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church, named as such because Sulacqua's patriarchal seat was fully absorbed by and entered into full communion with the Catholic Church, and Elia VI's patriarchal seat was not. This is what causes the lasting schism between the Elia line and the Shimun line. Sulacqua's allegiance to the Catholic Church, despite the Church of the East being the first split from the main branch of Christendom back in 431 CE. So the Shimun line and the Chaldean Catholic Church remained in full communion with the Catholic Church in Rome for about 100 years, but they started pulling away from Rome almost immediately. It started in the early 17th century when Shimon X began reverting back to the faith of Nestorianism, but it wasn't until 1672 when Shimon XIII Dinka severed all ties with the Pope, completely, thereby making him the last patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church. He's the last patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church. He is not the last patriarch of the Shimun line. This is because if they're not in communion with Rome, then there's no Chaldean Catholic Church, essentially. The Shimun line can survive without the Chaldean Catholic Church, and they can survive without Rome, but the Chaldean Catholic Church cannot survive without Rome, if that makes sense. That's not all. I also want to note that it's also during this century that the Elia line was trying to negotiate with Rome to get into Rome's good graces. Why they're doing this, I'm not super sure, but it's not super important. Also, the Chaldean Catholic Church's severance from the Pope led to there being now two Nestorian patriarchal lines, the senior Elia line and the junior Shimun line. But then it gets messier, because in 1667, Bishop Joseph converted to Catholicism. Bishop Joseph is a member of the Church of the East. Specifically, he was a member of the Chaldean Catholic Church, and he fully converts to Catholicism. And then in 1681, he went to Rome and he was officially consecrated as the patriarch of the Chaldean nation, deprived of its patriarch. So now there are three patriarchal lines in the Church of the East. We have the Elia line, we have the Shimun line, and we have the new Josephite line, which was in full communion with the Catholic Church until 1827, which is when they severed ties with the Catholic Church. When I said that the Church of the East decided that they were going to have problems, they really decided they were going to have problems. And then in 1771, Elia XI and his designated successor, Elia XII, they entered into full communion with the Catholic Church in Rome. So now we have the Elia line, aka the Church of the East, and the Josephite line, aka the Chaldean Catholic Church, in full communion with Rome, and the Shimun line is the only one to remain separate in their Nestorian beliefs, right? They're the only ones to follow the old faith of Nestorianism. But because the Elia line had joined up with the Catholic Church, power over the Church of the East transferred over to the Shimun line, making the Shimun line the patriarchs of the Church of the East, right? And I guess this means that the Elia line and the Josephite line at this time are fighting over power of the Chaldean Catholic Church. So at some point in the late 18th century, the Elia line decided that they don't actually want to be in communion with Rome anymore. They want to go back to the Church of the East. They want to go back to Nestorianism. And even though Rome was kind of like, fine, you can do whatever you want, they didn't actually let go of the Elia line because they were still recognizing members of the Elia line as successors and leaders of certain seats of power, but they kind of stripped them of their power by not recognizing them as patriarchs. So instead of being recognized as patriarchs, they're now being recognized as metropolitans or administrators. There are no more patriarchs. As far as my understanding, there's no more patriarchs of the Elia line and the Josephite line, at least in this time period. This is important because when Joseph IV of the Josephite line resigned from his position, Rome named his successor, Augustine Hindi, as administrator, not patriarch, meaning that Joseph IV was the last patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church. There hasn't been a patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church for 50 years, okay? So all of these problems are going down with the Catholic Church. The Shimon line is just kind of vibing as leaders of the Church of the East. They're chill. And then it gets worse. In 1804, Elia XI died, and the Nestorian branch of the Elia line died with him. Because the entire Elia line hadn't severed from the Catholic Church, Elia XI's line of the family severed, but the rest of the family was still in alliance with the Catholic Church, right? So the Nestorian line, the Elia line that had gone back to the Church of the East, died with him. So there's a problem of succession because Elia XI had two cousins. The first was Elia Ishoyab, who was formally recognized by Rome as Elia XI's successor, and he was consecrated as Elia the 12th, but Elia Ishoyab had renounced his Catholic faith. The second cousin was Yohanan Hormizd, who was unrecognized by Rome, but he considered himself to be a Catholic. And this created a rivalry between the two cousins. One of them was pro-Catholic, one of them was anti-Catholic, right? Yohanan Hormizd was eventually recognized as the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch of Babylon in 1830. And this is because Augustus Hindi, who was the successor of the last patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church, died in 1830. Even though Augustus Hindi had not been consecrated as patriarch, he was still the de facto leader of the Chaldean Catholic Church according to Rome. So Hormizd could only be consecrated as patriarch of the Chaldean Catholic Church after Hindi's death. And then Elia Ishoyab eventually died in 1804. I know I said that Elia XI died in 1804. That was wrong. Elia XI died in 1778. It was Elia the 12th that died in 1804. So he was the very last patriarch of the senior Elia line. So now we have the Shimon line as the sole inheritors of the traditionalist Church of the East that follows Nestorianism, and they are completely independent from the Elia line, which is consolidated with the Josephite line, and they are the sole inheritors of the Chaldean Catholic Church. And that's it. That's it. That's it. I could talk about what each of the denominations are up to in the modern day. There's definitely been a few things that have happened in the 20th century. I could talk about that. Unfortunately for you, I don't want to. The point of this video was to talk about the drama that caused them to split apart, right? Like that was the whole point, is to talk about like the major instances in history that led to these giant schisms. I don't really care about what they're doing right now. So yeah, that's the end of the video. Thanks so much for being here. I will see you next time. Goodbye.